Well, yeah, I mean, and it's always a challenge. I mean, a lot of the this was when you were describing your think tank, your policy institute. There were aspects of what works in Scotland that were similar. I mean, we were co-funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, which is one of the funding research councils in the UK at UK level, and the other half by the Scottish government, because we were, and I think when you are in Scotland, you will see that people might mention this. There was a very influential commission in 2011 called the Christie Commission on the Future Delivery of Public Services. And that was a key moment of change in the policy narrative about the public services of the future, about the governance of the future, about how we can rethink our institutions, but also how we can be more creative and effective with our public services, and what is the role of citizens and communities in being part of that collective leadership effort in a more participatory form of governance. So that created a space where a lot of these democratic innovations have flourished, like participatory budgeting, like citizens' juries, assemblies, those kind of deliberative processes, what we call mini publics, as well as new forms of digital crowdsourcing. And we've been very inspired by all kinds of global examples as well during the pandemic. Taiwan is one of the key references that we're trying to learn from in terms of digital infrastructure and how it can help to mobilize collective intelligence and collective capacity to act. So there's a lot going on in Scotland that I think, but a lot of it was given space for by that commission. And it was a commission that was set up by the Scottish government, but it was independent. And then after that, the recommendations and the very influential report they put out there then created a space where lots of other things happened, including the What Works Scotland program, where we were tasked with evaluating, with assessing, but also with proposing and experimenting and bringing new ideas. And so we did our part in trying to support the participatory budgeting agenda through research. We did our part as well through practice training. I love process design and facilitation, so I've done a lot of training with practitioners in how to develop participatory systems and new forms of governance at different levels, from community level to I'm interested at transnational level as well, and we now have some examples. So it's been it's interesting because we were set up in a similar way to both assess what's happening, but also challenge the status quo and propose positive potential actions and innovations. Ultimately, because as we know, our public policy systems, our public administrations are challenged by profound socioeconomic and environmental challenges, and we are the next 10, 20 years, they really will decide the future, not just of our countries, but collectively as our role on planet Earth. So we are in a hurry, and that starts for me from the local level and from community level to the transnational. So the better we get at setting up our public administrations to deal with complex challenges and to do so by going from existing elite-driven forms of governance, which played their role for a while in most countries. I mean, most governance systems tend to be elite-driven, with exceptions, but we now understand the limitations, and that it's no longer enough that only certain people get to shape the policy agenda and get to bring their creativity and energy in order to address policy challenges. And that's where the role of citizens and communities comes in. But it's not one size fits all. You need a vibrant ecology of different participatory practices, because these processes, they bring new things and they can do things that traditional forms of participation couldn't do. But at the same time, they bring their own new challenges. And a lot of them have to do with how to adapt these governance innovations, this forward-looking policy thinking and policy action and policy design, how to do all of that in a way that we actually set up foundations for a more responsive, flexible, agile, and a creative form of democratic governance. And so to me, these things are connected from the everyday needs and aspirations of citizens, of public service users, and then these big ideas about how we govern ourselves, the kind of collective forms of public governance we develop. Sorry, I'm going on a little bit,
No,
but
no,
this
this is great.
to place things in that bigger
Yeah,
picture, that these things are not just decidable because it's nice to involve people, or it's
yeah.
not just some kind of there are some very clear strategic and instrumental reasons to argue that we need more capacity for public action, and therefore that means involving the population. And an example of this is green participatory budgeting, for example, in the northeast of Scotland. If it we had the first experience this year, and Francesca can tell you more about this, and a lot of people involved in the Northeast. But in there, they are facing, Scotland. We can never, and this is why it's really good learning across countries, but it's also important to remember that context really matters, our own histories, and so on, which is why democratic innovators and policy innovators can never just copy things, right? We always need to adapt them. You cannot transplant. It's more like a translation. You might take inspiration, but then you still need to build on your own history, even to innovate, without being trapped by your own history, but building on it in a way that makes sense in the narrative of a place, of a country, of a nation, etc. Those narratives really matter.
Do you find
So,
that, just curious, because there's this whole evidence-based policy making movement, and
mm, mm.
there's I think the baggage of the medical intervention, of having
Yes,
an intervention that's context-free
absolutely,
versus social
absolutely.
interventions that are highly context-dependent, and I
Well,
find myself struggling with that all the time here.
yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and you know that is part of the elite-driven mindset, because early on, and again, I come from Spain, so our democracy is much younger than democracy in the UK. Our systems of governance are much younger as well, and you know, the recent contemporary history of Spain really shows, how difficult it is to build a new political system, to try and make it more inclusive. But it also shows that it can be done. It's not perfect by any means, but it certainly is better than it was 50 years ago, when my parents didn't get a primary school certificate because they couldn't really study during Franco's authoritarian dictatorship. So, sometimes when I'm feeling pessimistic, I try to remind myself that actually things do change, right? And these things. Now, as part of that, our systems carry with them certain commitments, right? This question of evidence-informed policymaking or evidence-based policymaking. It's true that there is a history there about, especially in the UK, for example, this is a history of the late 1990s and the early 2000s, the new Labour government at UK level, also in Scotland until 2007. And as part of that, there was a strong influence of the medical model of understanding evidence. I think now, 20 years later, we are much more aware of what some people call epistemic justice, which essentially means that knowledge comes in many different ways. And public action and policy action needs to be able to tap into and mobilize very different forms of knowledge. And that includes formal scientific knowledge, of course, but it also includes local knowledge, experiential knowledge, emotional knowledge, all ways of knowing that help us to have a better understanding of a complex issue. Because otherwise we cannot act effectively through policy unless we have and for that, to have that kind of complex perspective, you do need to open the policy making table to multiple ways of knowing. Now, of course, we are at a time of misinformation and disinformation, some bad actors in the political sphere with all kinds of, trolling farms, and all of that is there. That is true. But the robustness of our institutions depend on creating new spaces, and I would argue they need to be civic spaces where officials and citizens work together, that are capable of examining evidence or working through differences, bring different forms of knowledge, and then try to tackle issues. And we learned that as well from the way Taiwan dealt with the pandemic, the way they trusted in collective intelligence, the way they used viral information campaigns to inoculate people against viral misinformation and disinformation campaigns. So we're learning fast. It's a field that learns fast. And part of that learning is to understand that it's not enough to talk about evidence-based policymaking, because it depends on what you mean by evidence and how based it can be, because there are other considerations, economic, political, etc. But to talk about evidence-informed policymaking and considering evidence as a very capacious space where different ways of knowing need to be brought in conversation together, so that productively, through bringing together those different pieces of the puzzle, we can begin to grapple with complex issues.
And is the Christie Commission happen at the same time as the Community Empowerment Act? Were they related to each other?
You've really done your research on Scotland. I'm very impressed. I really am. That is fantastic. I mean, it's very refreshing as well because usually sometimes when we have these kind of meetings, I mean, people not always kind of put in the time to try and understand
No,
the.
bureaucrats asking me why Scotland, why Scotland? No, and actually, the reason why Scotland is because I was interested in PB, and then I saw, and then it just came out on my YouTube algorithm. Oh, PB in Scotland, and then you were there. After you were there, then more and more things from Scotland popped up doing my research. So then, wow, Community Empowerment Act, we gotta
Yes,
check
yeah.
this out.
Yeah, so the Christie Commission published its report in 2011. And after that, in parallel to that, there are two important factors here to understand this recent history. We actually kind of wrote a little bit about it in that book chapter about PB in Scotland that we in the book Hope for Democracy, which is an open access book. So the way we tell the story, we say that this space for democratic innovation was also opened by the prospect of having this independence referendum, which was controversial in the Scottish context, and as it divides opinion in Scotland. More just now it's a 50-50, so a really difficult situation. Before it was 37, 30-60. It's never been one way or the other very clearly. So it's a difficult issue. So what happened is that in 2014, we were going to have a referendum on this question, negotiated between the Scottish government and the UK government. And what happened in that space is that many people engaged with this discussion, and there was some actually quite good level of public deliberation, better than other processes, certainly. It was better than Brexit, that's for sure. In Brexit, we only had 6 months, and it was an elite-driven political campaign, whereas in the referendum, at least because it was 2 years, there were lots of new civic spaces that emerged in schools, in churches, in sports centers, in community centers, to try and talk more calmly about these things outside the partisan spaces of full yes, full no, less binary. And that created a space where many civil society organizations began to think about the quality of governance, the quality of democracy, the quality of our political system. And that was a space where many people decided that instead of talking about binaries, about the independence or not independence, we wanted to talk about how do we build a form of governance, of democratic governance, where actually we can be sure that we are being responsive and inclusive, and overcoming some of the challenges of our traditional systems. And that created a boom of civil society spaces and a lot of support for things like participatory budgeting, mini publics, digital. And this galvanized in 2014, there was a 2013-2014, the COSLA, the Convention of Scottish Local Authority Areas, the COSLA Convention on Strengthening Local Democracy. So that was an important moment following from Christie. And in parallel to that, between 2012 and 2015, we had a 3 years development of the Community Empowerment Act. I was in one of the advisory boards. It was still, when it started, it was called the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill. We worked for 3 years, and in the end, it came out, and no one was fully happy, no one was fully disappointed. So it was one of those where, there was a lot of compromise. For example, PB didn't make it into the legislation directly, but it was very clear that it was in the spirit of the legislation. There was an argument to say, well, we don't want to mandate it because sometimes mandating is not necessarily the solution, right? But we want to create a space where we're saying, yes, we need to share decision-making power so that we mobilize more people, get more legitimacy, more capacity to act. So in the end, there are some powers there that help to create a space for PB without naming PB directly. And there were other aspects of the legislation that were quite good and others that are very underdeveloped, which we are now working on. There is planning for future legislation this year on community wealth building, which is an interesting model of public sector and community sector economic innovation partnerships to develop new services, to develop new businesses, to create more community-oriented economies that are regenerative rather than extractivist, taking wealth away from communities. And the role of public sector investment in that is going to be really important. So make sure you take a look at community wealth building, because in many ways this is going to pick up some of the unfinished business from the Community Empowerment Act and other previous measures?
Some of our policymakers are visiting because they're particularly interested in the participation requests of the Act. And so, from my quick read of it, there were two key parts of the Act which were of interest. One is the participation request, and one is the community asset transfers. These two are mandated.
Yeah.
Or okay.
These two are, and participation requests are very peculiar, a little bit strange. We didn't. Those of us who were in the advisory groups, I don't think none of us saw that coming. We just saw it in the final version of the legislation after there were already previous consultations. So we're not quite sure where it originated, except that it seemed like one of the responses that civil servants wanted to give to the challenge of saying that sometimes people are excluded from decision making. So sometimes you have a local decision making process, and maybe there's a community group that has a legitimate point that might help to improve policy, and they should have a seat at the table, and there's no way of forcing authorities to do that. So participation requests are a compromise in that direction. It's something that allows, in theory, it could be a tool to open up the black boxes, the closed spaces of decision making, to new voices that come in to deliberate and to try and make even better informed.
That's interesting, because that feature came from not the civil society. It came from government itself.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, because it was a response. There were many different consultations for the Community Empowerment Act. Many of the responses that people that civil servants got in the consultation were about frustration with authorities not taking seriously citizens or communities or organized groups, which is always delicate, because often when you talk about organized groups, some people think that we're talking about lobbying, and just it's not that. The lobbying, elite-driven lobbying, happens even more behind closed doors with particular power holders. Here, what we're talking about is about groups. Sometimes a gardening group that has an idea on how to take environmental action in a particular neighborhood, or an urban arts collective that are imagining new ways of helping families of victims, or families of people who are in prison, or all kinds of social care and health care and sort of public social policy that and in many cases these collectives they have a lot of wealth of experience and they're shut out of decision making spaces. So bringing the wealth of their knowledge and their capacity can really be a game changer.
What's
And
your
we have
sense of has
Yeah.
it worked well, or is it
Well,
bureaucratic?
we've had examples in Scotland. One of the examples that we documented, for example, here's where it also depends on what priorities there are. But the Christie Commission, one of the priorities was to support prevention in policy. The argument being that a lot of our policy and a lot of our services, they are very reactive. We seem to only come to pick up when things are already in crisis, right? So instead of preventing people from falling off the bridge, you're picking people up downstream when they're falling already, right? So how do you shift policy expenditure and policy priorities towards prevention? And how do you do that in a way that helps to mobilize public resources in new ways that don't depend on silos? Right? Because a lot of policy areas, they are very siloed. They find it difficult to collaborate. So in Glasgow, we had one example. I'm going to give you a small example. There was a project called Operation Modulus. I will type it here, and there are papers in our website. Operation Modulus. This was the case of a neighborhood in Glasgow where a small group of young people were getting themselves into a lot of trouble. We're talking about major damage to public and private property. We're talking about burning cars. We're talking about a lot of illegal activity. It was a very small group. It was just 11 or 12 young people, but there was an entire neighborhood area of the city of Glasgow where they were having a negative impact on themselves and neighbors and people around. Now, for a long time, social workers, which are the typical problem owner in this situation to intervene, They just couldn't find a way forward. The police couldn't find a way forward because it was not just a matter of, low-level criminal activity and nuisance. The police didn't have the tools, right? They just had repressive tools, and that was not gonna work. It wasn't working indeed. So then, one of the things we have in Scotland are these places called the Community Planning Partnership, where all these different public services come together. That's it's the main piece of legislation for the Community Empowerment Act is about community planning partnerships. In that space, they started to say, well, how about we go this differently? Instead of the traditional silos, the traditional ways in which we allocate this policy responsibility. And there was someone from the fire and rescue service who said, well, let us have a go, because in our case, we're not the natural problem owners, because we're just coming when the car is already on fire, right? And we're not thinking enough about the prevention, right? Let us have a go. And they acted as facilitators, as participative leaders, or what we call facilitative leaders. They created a space where they started to bring these young people together. They started to ask and co-design with them, what can we do to help you do things you want to do, things you want to improve in your neighborhood, things you want to do for yourself. Some of them started to go down the pathway of apprenticeships. Some of them returned to education. Some of them got themselves into work. It had an 80% success rate in terms of positive destinations. It was a very small group, but nonetheless, a small group that was having a big impact. And it was a very successful 2-year program by the end of it. And it just demonstrates what you can do in terms of policy and services and tackling social issues when you let go of traditional ways of allocating budgets and you're prepared to share. But this is the issue with problem ownership, which is how our administrations work, right? The responsibility by different departments. And there's a very good reason for that, but that sometimes is getting in the way. Because this issue in that neighborhood in Glasgow, it was not just a social work issue. It was not just a police issue. It was not just a health issue or a fire and rescue issue. It was a social issue with all the complexity. So in that case, they were prepared to let go of problem ownership. But this is so difficult to do because if you let go of problem ownership, then you need to let go of budgets as well. And that's where the bureaucratic arrangements can get in the way. So that's just an example. And, participation requests, although they have a lot of potential to create such new spaces, they were created in a very technocratic way. And, sadly, they haven't been used by a lot of people. It's mainly certain groups who are already used to using these existing participative opportunities. So I don't think it's the most successful part of the act, but it is an interesting experiment. And then community asset ownership, that is, I think, fundamental and crucial. And in Scotland, it's really good that you're going to be talking to the Development Trusts Association, because they're going to share with you the power of having communities and policymakers and public services working together towards shared goals. It's really, really powerful what can be done when you build assets in a community, and then you can build a local economy and local services that have a strong, robust foundation because the community are involved.
It's interesting. Do you have a sense of how Scotland compares to other countries in terms of, it seems so progressive from our point of view, and I've not understood the level of community development, the landscape in other countries. What's your sense of, is Scotland far ahead?
Well, I need to say this is so. As I came here in 2005, and from a very different public administration and political culture. I'm from Galicia in the northwest of Spain. We have our own institutions as well, our own parliament in Galicia, our own language, different from Spanish. So in many ways, it's a connection. And actually, it's a cultural connection with Scotland because Galicia is the Celtic nation within Spain. So we have a Celtic connection with Ireland, Scotland, Cornwall, the French Brittany. So when I was looking from the outside to Scotland, I had that impression, very progressive. And the answer is yes and no in terms of how progressive it is compared to other countries. In the sense that it is true that things have been happening in Scotland that show that the center ground here is quite progressive, at least in terms of narrative, in terms of policy development, in terms of a lot of political rhetoric. but depending on what aspects of it you examine, then you will see it's a much more mixed picture. There is still there are a lot of forces, and again, DITAs, the Development Trust Associations, they can share with you. I think one of the documents they put out recently, which I found really helpful, was the response by DITAs to the public consultation by the Scottish Government on community wealth building. So they put out a document where they explain the existing enablers and barriers for the community sector to flourish. So I think it's very instructive. So it's not perfect by any means, but it is true that there has been quite a lot of cross-party political support. So, for example, Scotland's Climate Assembly, which was a citizens' assembly selected through civic lottery for direct deliberation, examination of evidence, and so on, that was supported by all parliamentary parties and created by them, from the Greens to the Conservatives to Labour to Nationalists. And PB has been done in all kinds of councils as well. It's true that the majority of councils in Scotland, for example, the Conservatives and the centre-right, they don't have as much power as other parties. But nonetheless, some of these things have been quite cross-party. And I think that has something to do with the narrative about politics in Scotland. The Scottish Parliament was only reopened in 1999, after 300 years closed, which is why they always say it's not that it was created, it was reopened. It was closed 300 years before through the Act of the Union, and then process of devolution of power started in the 90s by the new Labour government in the UK, and that meant a new Scottish Parliament that many people in Scotland have been calling for decades. It reopened in 1999, and part of the discourse around the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish political system, was to try and make it better than the British system, to improve and learn from the mistakes. So to make it more participative, to make it more community oriented, to make it also a parliament where there is higher quality deliberation rather than just empty gladiatorial, shallow debate. So there's a strong narrative about Scotland wanting to be a democracy that has learned from the limitations of other governance systems and that tries and creates a space where it can be more participative and more deliberative. But the reality is this is still a very elite-driven governance system, and you will learn that when you talk to practitioners. I don't do research from my office in the university. I spend my life in communities and with practitioners in all kinds of spaces. And once you're there, you realize that there are powerful forces at play, economic forces, all kinds of that structurally make it really difficult to advance this agenda, even when you have the policy rhetoric, the legislation, and so on. There's a big culture change that also needs to happen, and that's really difficult for our existing formal power holders, because sometimes they think that when they share power, they lose power. Whereas for participatory Democrats like myself, the fundamental theoretical and practical tenet is that when you share power, you generate more power, because by distributing power, you create capacity to act across the system. And in doing so, you become better at tackling issues. And this is what we've seen even during the pandemic. More decentralized forms of governance have been better than the hyper-centralized forms of governance. This is really important for all the policy areas where we are struggling at the moment. So I think it's, part of that
But
bigger.
I've kind of floated the idea of participatory budgeting to some of the MPs, and some of the concerns were, what if we let our citizens do this and residents do this, and what if their ideas don't get chosen, and will we be promising something that we cannot deliver? So that's their. What would you say to that?
Yeah, which is why the best forms of participatory budgeting have a deliberative component. So it's not just about the voting and the proposals, it's also about the careful deliberation and improving it. And this is usually better in climate assemblies, in mini publics, in citizens' juries. But PB in many places has begun to pay more attention to the quality of deliberation, because then that means that when there are proposals, politicians can get involved in helping to deliberate on them and engage with citizens, and it needs to be worked out. I mean, take the example of Paris, the city of Paris, which alongside Madrid, they are the largest PB processes in Europe. The case of Paris is very illustrative because there was a commitment in 2014 of spending 500 million euros. So at that time was the largest PB announced for Europe. In the city of Paris, they've been learning year after year how to do this and how to build this. And politicians have begun to see the value of it. That when you have a system, and in the case of Paris, it all starts with neighborhoods and people making proposals, but then those proposals need to be refined. You need to gather support, you need to explain why this is necessary. If you have evidence that might help, you use it as well to make your argument, all of that. Then it goes to a series of boards where there is an assessment. Is this technically feasible? Does this comply with equalities legislation, or is it discriminatory? Does this comply with health and safety regulations, or are there risks? All of those technical deliberations also happen, which then informs what processes and proposals make it to the next stage and go to the public vote. So once you build a deliberative system, then politicians can see that people can engage in complex argumentation. It's not just a matter of, it's not just it's not a direct form of governance, simply just clicking a button, yes or no. It's a more complex process with checks and balances. And the politicians who get involved in it tend to be absolutely fascinated and love it. And also the best of them tend to get more votes because they can get more visibility in their community, right? It's really powerful. I mean, take the United States, for example, which is one of the countries that has come onto the PB movement later in their history as well. The spread of PB has been South America, obviously starting in Brazil, is a global South innovation. Then South America, then it extended to Europe, then it was Asia, then it was Africa, and now North America is coming on the final wave. And it started in Chicago, and it started by a politician, Alderman Moore. He was a local politician who had a strong local presence. He decided that he had some discretionary funds, around $1 million or $2 million, so it wasn't a massive, but it was significant. And he decided that they were going to do it through PB. They have heard through the PB project in New York and some of the democratic innovators that were helping to adapt the idea. And they did it. And, the interviews with him are very revealing because he realized that he was also getting electoral credits from it, becoming more visible, doing what a politician is supposed to do, which is to represent a cross-section of their community the best they can. So a process that helps them do that, helps them to do their job as a politician, right? So in a way, for me, it's about realizing that these things don't work against each other. The best democratic innovations have involved politicians as key democratic innovators, as well as public servants, as well as people in civil society. So these things can never happen unless there is an alliance between more visionary and open politicians, civil servants, and civil society movements. But you need to see it to believe it. And a lot of politicians never get a chance to see these things. Those who get to see
Maybe I
them,
should bring some politicians over, but
that is often the most powerful thing. One of the reasons we ended up having a National Citizens Assembly in Scotland was because some politicians from here, some ministers, went to Ireland to learn about the Citizens Assembly in Ireland. And one of the reasons PB has exploded is because we did some early exchanges as well. For example, in What Works Scotland, one of the things that we organized was an exchange between politicians and civil servants in the city of Glasgow and politicians and civil servants in the city of Paris, so that they could talk about PB in Paris and learn from Glasgow.
I wanted to ask you about What Works because it's you were co-director from 2015 to 2019, and it was funded. But why is that funding ended, and what's up with the network now?
Yeah, so it's a good question about the history of What Works. So as you probably know, the What Works agenda is there are different versions of this, and there's a more global agenda, with the systematic reviews space, all that kind of stuff. And then there's a more kind of the UK agenda has a lot to do with that new Labour agenda of Tony Blair and others in the late 90s and early 2000s, where they wanted to bring a technocratic, some more critical scholars would say a neoliberal, this moment in which there's this narrative about public administrations in which,
The new public management.
well, yes, so and it's not in every country, so it's not linear, it's not global. But anyway, but the story goes like this: in places like the UK and to some extent Spain and France and Germany. So maybe it's more of a European phenomenon in that sense. In the post-war period, there was this moment, the 50s, the 60s. That's the big moment of public administration as a paradigm. The power of bureaucracies to provide universal services, generalized programs, all of that. Then come the 70s and the 80s, a critique of the monolithic nature of some of those programs and how much we could learn from the business sector, right? And that moment of the new public management era. So we go from the public administration paradigm to the new public management paradigm, which was this neoliberal thinking. Look, if only our public institutions were more like private sector corporations, we'll do so much better. Now, of course, that's the Reagan and Thatcher years, is the neoliberal ideology. In the early 2000s, this stuff starts to crumble as a paradigm. And then we go to a space now or what we call the new public governance, which takes from all the different strands. And this doesn't mean that the public administration paradigm is still there, but with an argument for more agile bureaucracies that can be more reflexive, more participative, more collaborative. Ideas from new public management era, they're still there. Of course, we still care about efficiency and performance. Everyone cares, but that's not all. That has to be guided by other things as well. And the new public governance era, all of those things are complemented by a strong participatory, evidence-informed ethos that creates deliberative spaces, all that kind of stuff, more partnerships, all that. Now, within that context, in the UK in the early 2000s, this sort of center-left New Labour, sort of with a new public management mindset, was thinking in this what works mentality, right? And they created the What Works network, which essentially was a series of what works centers. Many of them still exist in the UK. There is one on well-being. I think there's one on policing. There's one on children. There are different. There must be one on health as well. Now there was a moment when they realized we didn't have one in Scotland, and so we were a little bit late to the party. But nonetheless, the time came. And when the time came, there was a dilemma. Because by then, these centers, many of them started in 2006, 2008. By the time we were talking about it in Scotland, it was already 2012, 2013, the Christie Commission moment, all of that. And there was this idea that I don't know that we need a center. Because a center was going to place things in a particular part of Scotland and make it very central belt centric, which is something you might hear, which is Glasgow, Edinburgh as a pool, the big cities having, all the things happening in them and with other parts of the country forgotten, rural areas, the islands. We didn't want a center in that sense. We wanted a network. Now, it's true that still the two leading academic organizations were Glasgow and Edinburgh University, but the partnership covered the country, and we did work with all local authorities across Scotland, all community planning partnerships, things everywhere. But it was always meant to be a program and a network where we were bringing together researchers, practitioners, policymakers to, as I said earlier, take stock of progress since the Christie Commission. So that's why we did, and the Community Empowerment Act. So between 2014 and 2019. Initially, it was only going to be 4 years. We made the case for a 5th year to make sure we had a strong impact and legacy. But we knew it was going to dissolve because the theory of change for us was we don't need necessarily to create more dependence on a particular center. In our case, it made more sense to build capacity in different places. So we built a lot of capacity within our universities, within some of our collaborators, SCDC, the Scottish Community Development Centre, many of the other organizations across the country. We collaborated with them. And that was, whether it was right or wrong, that was the approach we took. So when the time came, the resources are still available. Most of us from the program are still available and working on similar issues, but as a coordinated network within a funded program, it ended there.
So there wasn't an intention to build a knowledge base that is accessible by everyone and to keep building that base. It was to divest.
Yeah, I mean, and as you probably have seen, all our publications are open access. We have some data sets that are in the UK data archives. The ones that could be shared, there's some ethical, especially when you do immersive rather than detached, immersive, collaborative action research, the kind of data you develop can be more sensitive sometimes because you're working with people every day. It's not just looking at things from afar, systems and policies, but with people every day. So our data archives do not contain the totality of what we did, but the parts that can be more useful. And certainly we have, I think, 100 and I can't remember, 140, 150 open access publications. So all of that is out there as a repository. But uh, let me put it this way. Funders do not always, I think it's changing now, but not all funders work on a long-term.
Mm.
And once you are mixed, once you are part of the budgetary cycles of government as well, in our case, 50% came from the Scottish government. Well, it's very difficult for governments to commit to longer term things. I think there was a case to say let's keep it as a hub, maybe let's reduce some of the budget, but nonetheless keep building and keep developing. But the other argument was, well, you were always set up to improve the capacity of existing bodies and institutions. So we have worked with COSLA, we have worked with the Improvement Service, with the Scottish Community Development Centre, with Public Health Scotland, with any institution or civil society, the Open Government Partnership, the Scottish Parliament. And we've been training people, we've been delivering training programs on facilitation skills, on knowledge brokering and evidence-informed policy, all these things. So the idea was always that we don't make our institutional and civil society landscape dependent on us. But I still think we could have done with another 5 years to consolidate, to be
Mm.
honest with you.
But the UK network is still being funded by the government.
The centers,
The centers
remember,
are funded.
those are centers. We were a network.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I guess
But also one thing, we didn't focus on one policy area. That's the difference as
yeah,
well. The others are police or
yeah,
children, or
that's right. How do you
in our
decide
case, it's
then on the
across.
focus?
Is the reform of public services, is everything.
Wow. It's like a general purpose what works network.
It was the Christie Commission agenda.
Yeah,
Is the
that's right.
entirety of our systems of public governance, public services, etc. So,
Okay.
and with that focus on prevention, participation, collaboration, and performance. The four P's of Christie, which you might hear when you come to Scotland, is prevention, participation. I forgot now the performance, and there's another P in there. Partnership instead
Right.
of collaboration. So prevention, participation, partnership, and performance.
And if
These are the
let's
four
say
famous.
our think tank decides that he has the ambition to start a What Work Center, what would your advice be for something like
Okay, well, you know what? My advice would be, I think the best thing we did was to learn from the strengths and the weaknesses of previous centers. And this is the advantage that you will have, that you can really learn. And I think there is something to be learned about the shortcomings of having something that is like a fixed center, versus the shortcomings as well of being something that is a little bit more diffuse, like a network.
that?
Maybe there's a sweet spot in between where you can be a hub that has a more permanent presence, but nonetheless is very networked with partnerships, with all kinds of relevant potential collaborators. So I think that's a lesson. The other one is to leave a space for innovation and unexpected things, because one of the best things in What Works in Scotland was that we had maybe 60% of our activities were within a pre-established program. We knew that we wanted to do some work on housing, on health, on disabilities, on prevention, on this and that. But we also left space and capacity to open up new spaces so that then we could be responsive to the Community Empowerment Act agenda, to all these things that were emerging, PB, etc. So I think that flexibility and agility, leaving a space within the program for action, and then to have a funding partnership where different and key stakeholders have a skin in the game. The Scottish government invested in this alongside the independent research councils. That meant that the Scottish government, they couldn't interfere. Our research was independent, but it meant that we could engage in robust deliberation that says, look, here's what we are finding. What does this mean for you? Does this challenge what you're doing? Do you need to do things differently? So there was this opportunity for direct impact. And that was really important. If the Scottish government hadn't co-funded us, maybe they wouldn't have paid too much attention to what we had to say.
Right.
So sometimes there is always this difficult question of independence, right? And I think we need to have a complex view on independence, because if you're too independent, you might be too far away from the spaces of power that you're trying to inform. If you're too close to power, you might have a research agenda that is not responding to people's needs and aspirations. So for me, we need to move from that mindset of simplistic independence to a mindset of interdependence and a politics of interdependence, where we realize that we need to have clear connections to the spaces of power and the formal traditional institutions, but we also have to have a space so that people can come together, think in new ways, act in new ways, develop new spaces for collaboration that wouldn't emerge from traditional institutions. And once you find that mix, I think that then you're in a strong space. That's what happens to us. We were very lucky that we then had this moment where we had quite a lot of convening power, which means that we could bring people together around issues and try and focus minds, inform discussions with evidence, but then push things further and work with policymakers very directly.
I think where we are, we're close to power. We're not so close to community yet. I do lots of work in community, but I think we should move closer to the community so that we can. Then the convening becomes more meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds great.